Hey guys,
Hello?
Hey, how are you?
Hey man, welcome to the podcast.
thanks for having me, man. How are you?
Pretty
Doing
good, pretty
well.
good. How are you doing this
Yeah, we're
morning?
excited to talk to you.
I'm good, man. I'm good. It's exhausting, but I'm enjoying it. So we're staying busy.
Nice. Well, yeah, you're only about 5 days out till the primary, if that's correct, in Virginia's first district.
Four
Sometimes
days
referred
out.
to, what was that?
4 days out. It's on the
4
23rd.
days, 4 days
Yeah,
now. Yeah,
yeah.
and you're in America's first district, as it's called in Virginia. Do you want to tell us a little bit about the experience in the primary so far, what it's been like campaigning in these unusual, kind of surreal conditions?
It's you said it. It's been unusual and surreal. I think we're trying to strike a balance of making sure we are cognizant and sensitive to the suffering that people are experiencing, the real human suffering that folks are going through, whether it's the pandemic, whether it's not having an income and just a financial strain that people, and that's a very real thing, right? Not knowing if you can make your rent is a very real pain. Ensuring people have enough to eat. We're cognizant about all these things, while also trying to get the message out there that we are in this mess because of conscious choices made by those in power, by complete failures of our systems that were designed to protect us, by refusing to listen to the science, by being arrogant enough to think that this is a hoax, so to speak. And we're doing that a couple of different ways that I'm happy to go more into. But for us, this is really a validation of why we need public servants who are actually dedicated to the public, not to corporate interests, not to the billionaire class and multi-millionaires. And if anything has been proven beyond a shadow of a doubt in these last 4 or 5 months, is that the status quo cannot continue. We need a reallocation of our priorities, and we need courageous people to come forward and say enough is enough. We need to give a damn, and we need to make a difference, and that's what we're fighting for.
One of the things that I thought was interesting is, you've had a pretty, successful career. You've written a number of books, and you've spent much of your life working, directly with the members of your community. What made you decide to take the leap and enter the electoral politics arena instead of just working as more of an activist and an outsider? What compelled you to take the congressional route?
I think it was the frustration of seeing the systemic injustices that I'm fighting against as an activist get worse. Wealth and income inequality is something I'm deeply passionate about solving. And when I grew up, we weren't rich. I mean, we lived for a while in Section 8 housing, needing food stamps. And I share that not so people feel sorry for me, but to share that if you look at the conditions of Americans now from 25 years ago, it's gotten worse. More people are living in poverty. The wealth divide is greater than it's ever been. And it's not because people are lazy or because people aren't working hard. They're working longer hours than they ever have. They're working more difficult jobs than they ever have, but they're bringing home less to provide for their families. And so when you're an activist or an advocate, you're able to provide support to one person or one group at a time. But when you're a policymaker, you can revamp the problematic or the unjust policies that are harming people in the first place. And the really scary version right now is not that our policies are broken. It's that they're working with such a vicious precision as to continue to oppress working families and people of color and marginalized communities. And that's the reality that we need to understand, that whatever policy you want to look at, we're talking about wealth and income inequality, forcing the living wage, the minimum wage to be $7.25 an hour since 2009, that's a deliberate conscious choice to perpetuate poverty. That's not accidental. That's not, oops, how did this happen? That's a conscious choice. It's working the way it was intended. Giving a $1.7 trillion tax cut, 83% of which went to the top 1%, that's not, oops, how did we get wealth inequality? That's deliberately making the problem worse. And so the shift for me came to the point where I said, I've gained enough experience in enough arenas firsthand that I can speak to these issues on a very intimate and competent and confident level, and how to resolve them as well. And so now that I've done this for a long time, I've experienced the struggle, and I've worked with folks who are hurting. now it's time to transition my experience, my workflow, my connections, my relationships to better policy. And if we can do that effectively, if we can rally enough folks around us to do that effectively, then if and hopefully when I'm in that policy position, the choices and the decisions that I make are going to be deliberate to help working families, to help marginalized communities.
Cool. If you win your primary in 4 days, you'll go on to face the incumbent Republican, Rob Wittman, who's been in office for over a decade, since 2007. Do you think your district is ready for a new representative? And what's your strategy for flipping your district blue after being red for over a decade?
Well, it's been red for 40 years. And he's a career politician. He's really just been in politics his whole life. And the evidence shows that people are ready for change. The evidence shows that people are sick and tired of not having healthcare access. He's voted to repeal the ACA over 40 times without a replacement. He's voted to cut funding for Medicaid and Medicare, which would devastate our lower income communities and our senior citizens and our veterans. He had the audacity to learn about the pandemic and then tell us that the virus is low risk and not spreading, and meanwhile buy himself pharmaceutical stock in COVID-19 treatment. He told us this into March, that it's low risk and not spreading, when we know it was absolutely spreading and devastating our communities. So people see that, and I can go into a whole laundry list of just his terrible, terrible policy positions, the least of which is not the fact that the president yesterday again praised Nazi ideology, and he still doesn't have, Rob Wittman doesn't have the integrity to say, this is wrong, Mr. President. We can disagree on politics, but this is wrong. So for me, when I talk to the folks in the first district, when I meet with them firsthand, I see very directly what's bothering them, what they're struggling and suffering through. And I see it's not just Democrats that are attracted to our campaign, it's independents and Republicans as well. It's not just liberals, it's also conservatives. And my message to them is, I commend you on putting country above party, because that's how we become a more perfect union, by focusing on this element of justice as our supreme aspect, not partisan politics.
What kind of a reaction do you get from people who have been kind of conditioned? As you said, your district's been red for over 40 years. That kind of leads me to believe there's a solid Fox News viewer base. People have been misled about a lot of these radical left ideas, supposedly like giving people access to health care and shelter and food. Could you talk about the reaction that real voters and real Virginians kind of give you when you propose things like, providing everybody with healthcare access and, changing some of our housing policy?
Yeah, I mean, I think you nailed it. There's a lot of misinformation that we have to kind of step back and say, let's understand, where our conversation is. Let's make sure we're speaking in the same language. And so I'll start with a premise to say, do we agree that our communities should be safe? I mean, like the big conversation right now is about police, right? And should we defund the police? And people hear defund the police and they think like, oh, anarchy, like The Purge, right? That movie where you just go nuts and people can do whatever they want. And so I'll step back and I'll say it to my conservative constituents and say, let's talk about what we agree upon. We both agree our community should be safe, right? We don't want criminals running around. We don't want people getting killed. We want there to be a safe community. Okay, great. We're on the same page. So now the question is this. If you or someone suffers from mental illness and you're having a mental illness or mental health episode in public, who do you want coming to help you? Do you want a man with a firearm who has no training in mental health treatment? Or do you want a trained mental health expert who knows de-escalation tactics, who knows how to respond and address you? And every single time they'll say, well, of course we want that mental health expert, right? That's common sense. I'm like, okay, that's what defund the police means. That rather than throwing more money at law enforcement and say, hey, go bring a firearm to something that doesn't require a firearm, let's take that same money and invest it in people who can actually help the community. That's how we keep our communities safer. That doesn't make you anti-police. It makes you pro-common sense. And meanwhile, that helps the police too, because we're not giving law enforcement 18 different responsibilities for things that they don't have the training to do. And when you present it that way, that look, we're trying to accomplish the same thing, The question is, how do we get there? And every time I've presented it that way, the response has been, that actually makes really good sense. And we should move forward on that. And so a lot of it comes down to having that dialogue, having that conversation. I don't believe Republicans are stupid or conservatives are stupid. I believe they're passionate and dedicated. And I believe there's a lot of misinformation out there that if we work together, we can help resolve and address. And that's what I'm fighting to do.
You've said that as a congressman, just to stay on the criminal justice reform topic for a second, that you would fight for a system that was built on, rehabilitation, reduced recidivism, voter reenfranchisement. Could you talk about how we most definitely need to reform the policing aspect of criminal justice in this country, but you've spoken a lot about what happens after that, right? We have so many men in this country, particularly Black men, and women in this country that are incarcerated. We have 5% of the world's population, almost a quarter of its incarcerated people. What do we need to do as a nation to sort of solve that problem from the other side once the arrest has already been made, essentially, once the damage has been done?
Yeah. I think at that point, if we're only looking at that point, we're doing ourselves a disservice. I think we need to look sooner and earlier. We need to start investing in early childhood education, because early intervention and early investment prevents the school or prison pipeline from happening in the first place. So that's the first thing that I think we need to do: heavily invest more in education and resources for children, especially from lower income communities, especially from historically marginalized communities, and that's regardless of color. The second thing we need to do is we need to, as a friend of mine who's a law enforcement officer says, because we need to decriminalize morality. And what he means by that is there's no reason law enforcement should be arresting people for marijuana. There's no reason why law enforcement should be arresting those who are addicted to narcotics. If addiction truly is an illness, why are you throwing that person in prison? A drug dealer is a different conversation, right? We can talk about that. I agree. But if someone is an addict, if someone is suffering from addiction, throwing them in prison is not going to do anything. If somebody has a heart attack, you don't throw them in prison, you send them to the hospital, right? And so that aspect is going to be huge, because right now, Black and brown communities use marijuana at the exact same rate, but Black communities and Black, brown, and white communities use marijuana at the exact same rate. But Black and brown communities are incarcerated up to a rate of 6 to 9 times higher than that of white communities. And so you create this caste system. And so you decriminalize that, you take that away, and suddenly you are significantly reducing our prison population. And you add to that getting rid of the private prison industry as well. This is modern day human trafficking, if you ask me. It's modern day slavery. There's no benefit to it. And then furthermore, once somebody actually is convicted of a crime, and they're paying their debt to society, we need to ensure that we don't strip away their civil rights. They should still have the right to vote. Just because somebody committed a felony, you should not strip away their right to vote. And I can make that argument based on the fact that the founding fathers of our nation never did that. This whole felon disenfranchisement concept didn't come about till about 60, 70 years after our nation was founded. So for those who want to talk about, we have to go back to the originalists and what the originalists thought, well, they never had that concept in the first place. This came about as a racist mechanism to disenfranchise Black communities. And then once they are released from prison, they've paid their debt to society. You cannot continue to force them to be denied financial aid for school, for housing, for education, for food, because that is what's going to accelerate recidivism and make them feel trapped to return to a lifestyle that maybe landed them in prison in the first place. Other nations, developed countries, have a recidivism rate of under 40%. Ours is nearly 80%, which is mind-boggling. I mean, that if you were selling a widget and you got 80% return sales, you would be a billionaire in no time. We should not make our criminal justice system a financially profitable system. This is about reform and rehabilitation, not making people rich. So I think we need to look at it in 3 parts. One is the early intervention and for early investment in education and in community. 2, making sure that we're not stripping away their rights once they are in prison, so they can still have a voice and play an active role in society in a safe and secure way. And the third part is post release, we can't continue to keep that ball and chain shackled to them. They've paid their debt to society. They need to truly be free and not continue to live a life of incarceration, even if they're not physically inside of a prison.
Qasim, you've also spoken quite movingly about running for Congress as a Muslim immigrant from Pakistan. I wanted to get your reaction to the recent Supreme Court ruling in favor of the DACA program, which was a massive success for immigrants' rights and a massive blow to the Trump presidency. Do you have anything to say about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that two things. One, yes, I think it was the right decision. It's frightening that it was on the razor's edge of 5-4. It should have been 9-0. But I think that it doesn't go far enough. This didn't ban Trump from ending the DACA program. It just said the way he did it was wrong. Yeah. And so he still could find another way to try to do it. And knowing him, he probably will. But I think that it's a step in the right direction. It makes our nation safer and more secure. It upholds our promise of due process that the Constitution guarantees, of equal justice under the law that our Constitution guarantees. And I think it speaks to what this country aspires to be. When Ronald Reagan talked about being the shining city on the hill, this is an example of what that is supposed to look like. So I think it's a step in the right direction, but I think we have a lot more work to do for comprehensive immigration reform.
Another question I had was, your district includes a lot of major military installations, and one of the ways that kind of the war profiteers, weapons manufacturers maintain a stranglehold on the Congress is by providing so many jobs to so many districts. Do you plan on voting against foreign intervention despite the military presence in your district?
Voting against foreign intervention? What does that mean?
Just American foreign intervention. Like, would you vote against a war, a war with Iran or something like that? If administration.
There's this tendency, this really shameful attempt by these war profiteers to try to tie these foreign wars into our local economies, and they want us to believe that if you don't let us bomb this country, then your neighbor will starve because their father or their mother can't earn a paycheck. And I just think that's such a shameful way of framing things. I reject that framing altogether. We have a constitution, we have due process of law, and the foreign wars that we fought in the 21st century, especially these preemptive wars like Iraq, have led to nothing but devastation and destruction for not only the Middle East, but also for our own national security here at home. And I would argue that if we truly, these are the same folks who claim all lives matter. Well, if all lives truly do matter, then what about the 5,000 soldiers that we've lost for under false pretenses? Do their lives not matter? What about the 1 million Iraqi and Afghan civilians that have been killed under false pretenses? Do their lives not matter? What about the tens of thousands of children now who are orphaned or more around the world, in Afghanistan and Iraq, here in the United States, because of this false pretense of a preemptive foreign war? So that's the human capital that we need to think about. That's the human cost that we need to think about. I don't care about how much money we're going to make if we're losing human life as a result of it. That's, for me, the wrong way of looking at things. I believe we need a strong military. I believe we need strong national defense and national security. I'm not naive to think that the world is this kumbaya place, and if we just hold hands and sing a song, everything's going to be okay. Every nation should have a strong military, but it should be built on justice. It should be built on this element of what is going to create justice and peace in the world. And you don't create peace and justice with violence. You create it with diplomacy. You create it by upholding human rights standards and maintaining them even when it's difficult to do. Jon Stewart has a great quote where he says that if you only hold up principles and values when it's convenient, they're not principles, they're hobbies. And I think we need to reflect on this and recognize that having a strong military is useless if every single problem is going to be met with a war. Because then what that does is that it creates a vicious cycle of more violence, which will ultimately harm our national security. And sure, we have enough nukes to destroy the whole world 10,000 times. Well, all you need is one. And this idea that we're somehow a stronger military because we have 10,000 nukes doesn't really make sense. We need to focus on justice and maintaining a sense of international protocol where if we are going to be a world leader, It needs to be in diplomacy and bringing parties together and resolving conflicts peacefully and in a manner that saves human life, not in a manner that perpetuates the arms trade and creates more violence and war.
Have you, during your campaigning, seen a dwindling sort of support for the overseas, constant, endless war in Virginia, even where the military is quite active domestically?
There's there's this myth, I believe, that people in the military actively, pursue these kinds of wars. And the folks the veterans that I speak with, the folks in the armed forces that I know well, don't. Nobody wants to go to war. I mean, this is not something like, Call of Duty. It's not a video game, right? It's a very real thing. And so what folks at our military bases want, and I've spoken with them and I speak to them regularly. We have a veterans committee on our campaign that's intimately involved in these things. What they want is America to uphold the ideals of justice that is our founding promise. They will go to war if they need to defend the United States of America, as they taken an oath to do, which is I think is the right thing to do. But they don't want to be used as pawns, like they were in Iraq. Like they're being used as mercenaries for the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, according to one report. So when I look at our military bases, I'm grateful that we have military bases, and I'm grateful to the men and women in uniform serving our country. But I also listen to them and recognize that what they want also is peace. They want to be with their families. They don't want to deploy if they don't absolutely have to. And so my responsibility as a member of Congress would be to ensure that if we do deploy, or if we vote for an authorization of military force, it is under the pretense of absolute justice, not under some kind of economic policy to make billionaires even more money.
One of the things your campaign has highlighted that I think has been a major blind spot on the left has been rural America. You talk about how we need to create policy that addresses a lot of the issues that are afflicting our rural populations. And I think that one of the things that people on the left need to realize is that a lot of the problems facing our urban communities are also problems in more rural areas, like food deserts, lack of access to the internet, pollution. Could you talk about the intersection of those issues and what we can do to provide solutions for our community?
Yeah, I mean, this is really part of the forgotten America that from an economic standpoint and from a healthcare standpoint, education standpoint, that I'm paying a lot of attention to. I'm meeting with local farmers in the rural parts of our country. I'm meeting with school teachers, with healthcare workers, small business owners, and there's just been a lack of basic investment in rural America. 40 million Americans still don't have high-speed broadband internet access. 40 million Americans. I mean, that's more than most countries, right? And so imagine you are in a rural part of the country and you want to start a small business. You don't have broadband. How are you going to do it? You're not. Imagine that you're a small farmer and you need to have the data necessary to know where to plant your crop, but you don't have broadband to get that data. So how are you going to maintain your crop? Imagine that you're a hospital and you want to provide better health care to your local community, but you don't have something as simple as broadband to get the technology necessary. How are you going to provide that health care? Imagine that you're a school that's shut down due to a pandemic and you want to do remote learning with your kids, but they can't get on the internet. How are you going to do remote learning with your kids? So across the spectrum, rural America has been forgotten, and people like my opponent, Rob Wittman, has kind of been leading the charge in forgetting them. In the 12 years he's been in office, he's done virtually nothing to get broadband internet access accessible to the rural parts of our district. And we see that. I've spoken to grandmothers and grandfathers and parents devastated that their kids went away to college and never came back. Because why would they? There's no jobs that they need in these rural parts of the country. And it's difficult to come back and start anew when you have a great job offer available in DC or Chicago or New York or even smaller cities like Richmond. And that's, I think, where I'm trying to spend as much time as I can in the rural parts of our district, even though some of these counties only represent 1 or 2% of my district. I'm trying to spend as much time as I can there to let them know that I see them, I hear them, and I want to be a meaningful advocate to help them get the support that they deserve, not that they want as like an entitlement. This is basic human dignity, if you ask me. So one of the things that we're proposing is that broadband internet needs to be treated like a regulated utility. And the federal government should work directly with local municipalities to make that financial investment to build out the broadband necessary. And the cost of that is about $300 to $350 billion, which is a lot of money, but it's also a drop in the bucket compared to what we've already spent. We've spent, $8 trillion so far in the last 3 months with this pandemic. $350 billion is a drop in the bucket compared to that. And it would get broadband access to 40 million Americans. It would revitalize rural parts of the country, make sure the small businesses can contend, make sure that schools now have adequate resources to provide for their students, make sure that hospitals can get the healthcare access they need, make sure that the small farmers can get the data they need to be successful. That infrastructure is so vital, and it will really be a shot in the arm for rural America to bring them technologically to the 21st century. And the only reason we haven't done it so far is because so many politicians are in the pockets of major corporations who don't want that to be built out because it will cost them money. It will hurt their bottom line. And I think that's not only cruel and malicious, but it's contrary to our constitutional principles of we the people, not we the corporation. So I'm actually glad to see you guys noted that we're paying a lot of attention to rural America, because it is very important to us, and we will continue to do so throughout this election and beyond.
Yeah. Well, Qasim Rashid, you seem like the right candidate to represent your district and go on to face that Republican. And Rob Wittman, we hope you do well and wish you luck in your further endeavors. Thanks so much for being on the podcast today.
Thanks, guys.
Yeah, thank you. We appreciate it.